best place for below average Star Wars.
Hello there, and welcome to the Star Wars Show, a UK-based Star Wars podcast with in-depth discussions and analysis sprinkled with some, and maybe today, a lot of silliness. We are here to talk about The Acolyte. We are up to episode 7 of The Acolyte, and we will be deep dive reviewing that episode here today. If you have not watched episode 7 of The Acolyte, I definitely recommend you pause the podcast right now, head over to Disney Plus where it's streaming, give it a watch, and then come back and then listen to us get silly about it, because if you don't, you're going to have it all spoiled. But now for the introductions, I am the Geordie Jedi Pete.
I'm Kat Rusielka.
And I am still just Chris.
And Chris, we've got a bone to pick with each other actually, because we're both very wrong from last week. Obviously, we thought there was a new Jedi called Mark, Marky Mark, that type of thing, but it's been disproved. There's a character bio come out from official Star Wars, and he's called Mog, M-O-G, Mog. How do you feel? Do you feel mugged off that you thought he was called Mark?
I'm shocked, if I'm honest. I'm not sure if Mog's a better or a worse name.
I think it's better.
But I was sure he was called Mark.
But I mean, maybe it's just our northern ears. But I definitely thought he was called Mark. And as was said, it was definitely it was said more than once, the name of the episode, and both times I had no doubt that it was not Mark.
No,
but it's not Mark.
No, I can see it with my own two eyes on StarWars.com in front of me. He's definitely called Mog, but I don't know. He looks like a Mark to me.
So Mark, and then Mog the Mark. That's what we'll call him. Any wrestling fan.
Mog the Mark.
He's a Hogan Mark, I heard. But yes, speaking of last week's episode, obviously we are joined by the lovely Kat, who is of course always fantastic to talk Star Wars with, especially when we're talking about things like Kylo Ren or Kamiya's arms, or just how cute creatures are in Star Wars. And obviously we missed your sort of deep dive into episode 6, Kat. So I don't know if you want to give us just a brief rundown of the greatest hits of what you really loved about last week, and then we can dive straight into episode 7 afterwards.
I love how my defining characteristics have become my love of dark side characters and strange and cute Star Wars aliens. Yeah, I think it's true. It's to the point. Last week's episode I found very interesting because it was called Teach Corrupt, and it was this dichotomy of the dark side versus the Jedi, what the Jedi teach versus a much more dark side point of view. I'm not going to say Sith because I still maintain the belief that Kamir is not a Sith. And what he's talking about to Osha, it does make a lot of sense. He's talking about how her feelings are relevant and important. We learn why Osha felt she needed to lead a Jedi Order. She thought her feelings were blinding her and not allowing her to embrace her full Jedi potential, which Kamir then says isn't a bad thing. In interviews, it's been stated how this series is very much looking at the seduction to the dark side. And yeah, I think it was very obvious in last week's episode how the dark side could be quite compelling an argument. But yeah, I absolutely loved the episode, and the tension brimming between Osha and Kamir, the stranger. It was beautifully shot, and it reminded me of a very well-written romance novel. It just... I am very interested to see where those two characters go.
And obviously you said it was beautifully shot. Was that, of course, the nice swimming scene that was filmed?
That was unexpected, but Kimia knew exactly what he was doing. Like, he knew Osha was there the entire time and decided to take seduction to the dark side very literally. Yeah. Well, I suppose what I also found very interesting, though, is how the costumes then changed after that scene, because Kimia is wearing whites and greys while Osha is wearing these much darker colors, suggesting how Kimia may be a Darksider, but he does have, I suppose, good qualities in a way. I mean, he did make a soup and he did let her have his bed. He was sleeping on the floor. So, good qualities.
I mean, we definitely discussed the colour change of like the black sort of acolyte tunic to then the sort of the softer fabric and also the actual like light of it. And obviously in Star Wars, I think costuming has been, if you look at Luke Skywalker and Return of the Jedi, it's black, and then the sort of the white flap reveals itself when he throws his lightsaber away and defies the Emperor. Anakin's Jedi robes are very much darker than everyone else's throughout the prequel trilogy, sort of simulating him going to the dark side and becoming Darth Vader, I suppose. So, yeah, very, very interesting. But yes, obviously a very cool episode last week, with a lot of tensions riding throughout. And then we come back to episode 7, which is what we're going to be deep diving today. It is called Choice. It's streamed on July the 9th, 2024, obviously in the US. Central America, so it would have aired in the morning of July 10th if you're in the UK or in the European continent. Again, episode 7 called Choice, directed by Kokunada, who is, of course, the same director as our previous episode that was on Brendok, episode 3, which was our sort of first flashback episode. And then this is the companion piece to it, shall we say. I'll dive in with a brief synopsis of the episode and then we'll dive into our thoughts. So, as I said, it's a flashback episode, a companion to episode 3. This is episode 7, Choice, and it's 16 years earlier. The 4 Jedi discover the Coven while investigating a potential emergence in the Force on Brendok, which could create life. The Jedi Council decides that the twins are too old and should be left with the Coven, despite Osha's wish to become a Jedi. Mother Coral stokes May's anger over Osha's decision, leading to May accidentally starting a fire. The results for the twins' M count, which shows their force sensitivity, indicates that they were artificially created with a single consciousness split into 2 bodies. Torben, eager to return to Coruscant, sees this as proof of the virgins and rushes to retrieve the girls. Sol follows, and the pair confront the Coven before Kelnaka and Endara arrive. Sol kills Anasea when she attempts to use her power. The witches possess Kelnaka and use him to attack Torben and Sol until Endara overpowers them. Sol is able to save both May and Osha from the burning fortress. He's unable to save both May and Osha from the burning fortress, and chooses to let the side of the bridge that May is on go, and he's able to grab Osha and save her. They return to Coruscant, and Dara decides to blame the incident on May's fire and not tell the council about Sol's actions, so he can train Osha as his Padawan. So that is sort of the basic sort of rundown of the episode. I think there's definitely a lot of talking points to talk about. Let's go to you first, Kat, I suppose. What was your thoughts on sort of, we see the Jedi at the beginning and sort of doing reconnaissance, the sort of collecting samples of life on the planet, whether it be moss, rocks, bits of tree, mud. Kelnaka's got a old school metal detector out. He's searching for things in the ground. So what's your thoughts on the setup of sort of the reasons why the Jedi are on Brendok in the first place?
We mentioned earlier when we were talking about The Acolyte, and I think episode 3 specifically, that it seemed the Jedi had been on Brendok for a while before finding May and Osha. And this episode completely confirms that. In fact, the Jedi weren't even there searching for the Coven to begin with. They were there searching for emergence in the Force. It helps to explain why they were so well prepared with the ship, the speeders. This was a full-on expedition to Brendok to search for this vengeance. I think it's a great tie-in to Light of the Jedi, because Indara mentions how Brendok had been badly impacted by the Great Disaster, the Great Hyperspace Disaster, which happens right at the start of Light of the Jedi by Charles Soule, which is this terrible calamity in hyperspace that results in a ship being blown to smithereens because of the Nile. And it poses an extreme threat to many planets within the system where it explodes. During the events of Light of the Jedi, the order of trying to save a very specific planet, Brendok isn't mentioned, but it must be within either the same system or a close system in order to have also been badly affected. And it just felt like a great science expedition. It was sort of combining this mysticism of the Force with a much more grounded scientific view, almost, as the Jedi are searching for life, searching for M counts, I'm guessing, in the samples they're taking of the plants and the plant life. Interesting, I noticed that there doesn't seem to be any animal life on Brendok. So maybe that hints that whatever happened to it during the Great Disaster did wipe out some of the life until the Virgins then brought that life back in, but animals have yet to re-emerge. It also helps to explain how the Coven are able to live in such a grand structure, because it means that it existed well before they came to Brendok and well before the events of even Light of the Jedi. So it just adds so much history to this planet. And yeah, I did a little squeal when basically I realised why Indara and the Jedi were on Brendok to begin with.
Yeah, I think just to recap that, so obviously, they mentioned that the hyperspace disaster occurred 100 years like before this moment that we're seeing, sort of before their mission on Brendok. And we see, it seems like they show us maybe a piece of the ship that blew up in hyperspace and then sort of took out nearby systems. And I get the feeling maybe the Jedi here, because after the disaster, obviously Brendok was affected heavily, it seems like. And obviously the fact it's sort of rebirthed itself so fast is probably why they're thinking maybe the forces at play here and not just not nature on its own. So yeah, very, very, very interesting. And then that would seem like the mining operation, which is where the Coven are based in that old mining area, sort of dates back to the hyperspace disaster and sort of the beginning of the High Republic era as we know it in the storytelling. And I think that way time's also depicted as, the Jedi, obviously they're collecting samples so they can look into them for M counts. I think you bang on there, Cat. And I think this time of them just being here, really being bored, just looking at plants and foliage, ties into Tobin being homesick for Coruscant. They haven't been here a week or a couple of days. It seems like they've been here a while. And that's why he's missing Coruscant, which obviously plays into the episode quite a lot, as we'll get into soon. What's your thoughts, Kat, just before we go over to Chris? Like, obviously, they've used the term, they've used the term virgins early on this episode. Virgins has obviously, been said a lot in Star Wars at very important times, especially, Anakin is a virgin in the Force, where the midi-chlorians are around a boy, and they believe that it's to do with the prophecy, obviously. So I feel, they haven't just used that word willy-nilly. They've chosen that word virgin in this episode, on purpose. So what's your thoughts when you hear the term virgins in terms to the planet, and also virgins in regards to May and Osha, and how it ties into maybe Anakin and the prophecy?
Absolutely. Virgins is such an important word in Star Wars. It's such an important concept. It's referring to this greater, wider cosmic force that's pulling the strings of destiny, or the threads of destiny. We're in the Acolyte, threads of destiny. I think the first time we really hear it being said is when Qui-Gon presents young Annie to the council and says he thinks the boy is a virgins in the Force. A virgins is typically referred to times where the Force has either created life or created a very large area of power, I suppose. Because after seeing it being referred to Brendok, of it being a place of emergence in the Force, I'm starting to think that both Planet X in the High Republic and even Mortis are now vergences in the Force. So it's these areas where the Force is basically sort of blessed, or even people, because Anakin was created by the Force. When it comes to the girls, when it comes to May and Osha, I think it's probably going to be a little different. We know that Anakin was created by the Force as a way to balance the Force. My theory is that the Vergence is present on Brendok, and Mother Anastasia was able to tap into it somehow, bend it to her will to split this consciousness that we know May and Osha seem to share. So I think it's different to Anakin, but it is referencing this very important source of Force energy.
Yeah, definitely. Chris, let's go over to you to sort of, what's your thoughts on sort of what the Jedi are doing here and sort of the wider ramifications of, investigating what the Force is up to, I suppose.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because we've never really seen the Jedi like this, at least in live action, as far as I can remember. I mean, mainly we saw them not really existing, just kind of fragments, and then in the prequels we saw them, but they were very quickly, we only saw them dispatched on a single mission that very soon turned into this giant war, and then into the Clone Wars. So it's interesting just to see them just sent off to a part of a galaxy, and well, like they say, just sort of hanging around, really, just using a metal detector, seeing what they can find, like your grandfather on the beach, investigating the local fauna or flora, I suppose, and it does seem a bit unusual at the beginning. We're not sure why they're doing this, and then obviously it gets explained later when the Padawan very clearly doesn't understand what they're doing either. He's a nice character for us to understand why the Jedi are doing this, and they're looking for this vergence in the Force. And it's an interesting concept of how one exactly searches for this. I wasn't quite sure what they were looking for exactly, because they just seem to be sort of looking for signs on the ground of a vergence. But I mean, I guess they must be trying to look for some sort of hint that this is why Brendok has become such a lush, beautiful planet after this hyperspace disaster.
Definitely. Then something about the creatures Kat mentioned, I think Star Wars doesn't need an excuse to show us like creatures on the ground. So I think the fact that they're not here is on purpose, and the only real animal life we see really is those butterflies that we see Osha and May use the Force on, and that's it really. So very, very interesting.
Well, I suppose you do maybe have to wonder about the logistics of what the Coven were eating.
They're vegetarians, probably.
Yeah, I guess it must be.
That was my next point. I think we see them with the bows and arrows, right? But we see them in their camp, but we don't see sort of, that we can make those tasty spice cakes, whatever they're called. but other than that, we don't see any animals. They're not wearing loads of furs, for example. So yes, very very interesting. Sort of moving on from there, I think I just want to talk about. We've mentioned it briefly there, but Tobin, obviously, hasn't been in this episode much, the same as Kalnaka, who we'll go on to as well. But, in episode 2, May was able to kill Tobin, or Tobin was able to kill himself. And he obviously was dealing with a lot in his mind there. We'll go to you first, Katus. What's your thoughts on Tobin and how he's depicted here and how he's feeling and sort of how that leads to the man he becomes, I suppose?
Torben is depicted as a typical city kid. He can't survive being surrounded by nature and plants. This idea of Padawans being unsure about themselves, unsure about their missions, is something we've seen before during the Clone Wars, even during Rebels. How many times did Kanan have to explain to Ezra to be patient, to reach out? I think that was probably the energy that Torben was bringing. He wanted some kind of high action adventure mission that had very obvious repercussions, but the mission he'd been sent on is to study plants. And it is important. Indara is trying to get him to understand how it's important. This vergence in the Force, this source of power for the Force. It's very likely the Jedi may even be able to use it themselves. So what they're looking for is important, but to Torben it doesn't seem that way. And he is shown to be frustrated, homesick, and it leads to these choices that ultimately have terrible repercussions. And I think it's this selfishness that Torben displays in this episode that helps to explain why May is able to manipulate him into taking that poison. Because what Torben ultimately decides, the choices he makes, does lead to a lot of terrible things happening.
I just want to dive in on that. I think, when they begin to use the witchcraft on Torben, in episode 3, when we see, it's quite fast and happens quick. But, when we see it here, we sort of take the time to delve into Torben's mind. And I'm super intrigued by sort of the idea that, and I think this isn't like, this is sort of subtly implied. I wouldn't say it's definitely happening, but I think you can take away from it if you look at it a certain way. That, like this kind of witchcraft appears to require consent, or maybe she's just toying with him, who knows? But, Mother Anastasia, in his mind, is talking to him, she's preying on his fear that he wants to go back to Coruscant and leave the planet. And she's bringing that up in conversation with him, telling him that, she needs to ask to go back there. And almost like the person that you're trying to sort of possess has to sort of welcome you in. And it reminded me of sort of classic horror movies, from if you look at like vampires, for example, like they kind of just come across the front door, they kind of break the window and climb in, they need to be invited in. And it just seemed sort of to be pulling on those threads a little bit. Chris, I don't know what your thoughts are on that before you give us your thoughts on Torben as a whole, I suppose.
On the vision of that Mother Anastasia presents to Torben. Yeah, it was interesting. It was very. It was a bit more erotic than I was anticipating. She seemed very much to be sort of tempting him in various ways as well. Not explicitly, not so much as the stranger last week, but it seemed very laden with desire and trying to tap into a young person's fears and desires, and not only his desire to go home, but just various other desires that he might have to kind of breakaway. It was very interesting of seeing how it was presented. I've seen some people wonder online if this is sort of how Jedi mind tricks work in general. I don't think that's the case, but it's a novel idea. Thinking that when a Jedi mind trick happens, there might be something else that we're not seeing.
That's very interesting, isn't it? I think there's a lot of questions about the Force that, in general, that haven't been answered, and many of them probably never will be. I think this episode as well, we'll get into it later, but this episode sort of answers what really happened on Brendok that night, but it also leaves a lot of things open like this. And sort of, what's your thoughts on Torben as a whole, Chris? As the Jedi Padawan who just wants to go back to Coruscant, and the Jedi Padawan who ultimately ends up having to fight Kelnaka, gets wounded, and maybe it's more the emotional wound that lasts with him for a long time and leads to him taking his own life.
I mean, he's very headstrong. He's very immature. He's the complete opposite of the way that we were first introduced to him, where he was a stoic Jedi Master, really. He is sort of in the sort of Luke role from episode 4 of making very brash, silly decisions, is not fully grown, and it seems that he's almost possessed with this idea of getting back home. And you kind of sit there and watch it and you think, what a series of stupid decisions he makes during this episode. But he's really the catalyst for what ultimately leads Sol into the position of killing Mother Anastasia, and then, then leads to the other mother encouraging the fire to break out. And it's the catalyst to all of these things, from this one simple desire that he has to go back home. And he's not really portrayed as particularly likable in this episode. He's in that annoying vein of kind of like a teenager.
No, definitely. And obviously this is 16 years, so within the next 16 years he ends up obviously becoming a Jedi Knight and a Jedi Master, which is pretty good, and then ends up taking the Barish vow obviously at some point after that. So I wonder if we'll ever get any adventures showing us his sort of fast rise to Jedi Master, but then also how it ends up him going into deep meditation. Speaking of sort of Mother Anastasia and the showdown between the witches and the Jedi, I thought the witches come across as quite selfish here. When Mother Anastasia is telling them that, Osha, I'll probably let Osha go if Osha wants to go to a choice. And the other witch is like, no, we need to keep them both here. And like all of them are like that. So they all seem to be quite selfish, and Mother Anastasia is the only one who's not. I don't know what your thoughts were on that moment, Kat.
Well, I absolutely loved Mother Anastasia in that moment. The way she says, I choose to be mother, is just, it gave me chills. The way she said that, the strength with which she stood her ground, absolute respect to Mother Anastasia. But it then raises the question of, why are the girls so important to this coven? Why are they determined to keep May and Osha together? What was ultimately the goal of the Ascension ritual? Is the Ascension going to grant them more power? I would love to know what basically the entirety of the Ascension was meant to do, because that may help explain why the Coven wanted to keep the girls so badly. And ultimately, it does seem from previous episodes that the girls were meant to be the next leaders of the Coven, assumingly with May taking on Mother Anastasia's role and Osha perhaps being like a number 2. And the Coven's actions just seem to very much reinforce this idea that the girls are there not necessarily out of a place of love, but out of a place of necessity. Except for Anastasia. Anastasia clearly loves these girls and is adamant that if Osha wants to choose her own path, that she can. But then that suggests that maybe the Ascension wouldn't have granted them any more power because Anastasia wouldn't necessarily let Osha go. It's just all these different possibilities, but all these different points of view lead to all these different choices, and it's just so cleverly written how every choice in this episode makes such huge impacts on characters and the overall destinies of each character.
Definitely. And I think that, speaking of Mother Anastasia, as I said, Saul seemingly kills Anastasia with a lightsaber blow at the chest, but Mother Anastasia sort of turns into that black magic type possession, but she seems to do it in more of a peaceful way, and I don't quite know what she's trying to do in that moment. It doesn't feel like she's going to be on, like she's not. From my point of view, watching, I didn't feel like Mother Anastasia was on about to go on a vicious attack. So it all seemed quite strange,
No,
and then
it
Saul
didn't.
seemed quite sorry it had happened, and it almost felt like maybe she should put herself on Saul's blade. I don't know what your thoughts were, Kat, on Mother Anastasia's demise.
That power she embodies, where she almost disintegrates into this black, smoky powder, it reminded me of the Night Sister's teleportation magic. It wasn't, because Night Sister magic is always some form of green, but it did seem to be in a similar vein. And I wonder if Anastasia was trying to get to May, or even get to Osha, if that was some kind of teleportation magic fueled by dark side powers. But it was definitely something peaceful. Saul basically overreacted in that moment, and it's absolutely tragic what happened. The way he reacts instantly yet wrongly, stabbing Anastasia with his lightsaber. And I think she forgives him the way when she's talking to him as Saul holds her. There's no anger to Anastasia. She does seem to forgive him for what he's done, but it does help to explain why Saul does not reach for his lightsaber very quickly in battles. And when he was initially fighting May, he must have been reminded of that very moment. So he doesn't reach for his lightsaber because the last time he overreacted, he killed a mother in front of her child. So that whole scene was it was beautifully written in its tragedy.
Chris, what was your thoughts on Mother Anastasia in the episode, and then also on Mother Anastasia's demise?
Yeah, she really kind of puts her foot down in this episode in so much as, that scene where she chooses to be a mother. She's, despite the episode 3, when, shows we get hints that she is going to allow Osha to leave, she doesn't really, we don't witness her coming out and really being explicit. She needs to think about it. She needs to take counsel, blah, blah, blah. But she clearly doesn't, we get the feeling she doesn't really want her daughter to go. But here she's, we get that decision. But then there's that moment when she dies, and she turns into smoke, and it's kind of, it's a bit of a scary sort of image that we're looking at. And it took me by surprise when Saul drew his lightsaber, and well, the main thing that took me by surprise was that he was successful. I didn't think that he was going to be able to kill her right there. I thought maybe she might have dissipated into the smoke, but he does. She quickly returns to her human form, and then she has that sort of moment when she looks at him, and I think this is where the true guilt lies with Saul. He's just killed a mother in front of her daughter. Then, in her dying breath, she says, "I was going to let her go anyway." And then later on, of course, he has to make that choice between the two girls as well. But we'll go on and talk about that a bit later, I'm sure. But Mother Anastasia seems very much like she's got her daughter's best interests at heart, whereas The other members of the Coven, I'm right, I agree with you. They do seem to be acting very selfishly. They never anticipated the Jedi showing up. They have no intention of letting them go. And all they want is the survival of their group, their Coven, that they want, and they have no desire to let Osha go.
Indeed. Kat, I want to go to you. Like, obviously, we've talked about Mother Anastasia. Obviously, Mother Coral, sort of maybe the opposite end of the spectrum. You know, we see Mother Coral be very angry towards the Jedi, maybe because that, you know, there's a threat that Osha could leave with them, maybe. Because, you know, she's very angry about that and, you know, attacks them and vicious and, you know, he very much sends me out there to cause havoc without thinking of May's own feelings. She just wants me to be an acolyte, really. She wants me to be a tool for danger and anger in this moment and causing damage and eruptions. You know, she's sort of sending her own child to cause hell. I don't know what your thoughts were on Mother Coral's actions and how she's acting in this episode.
Mother Coral was absolutely awful. Oh my gosh. The way she manipulates May into these feelings of anger and aggression. Coral was just warmongering this entire episode. She clearly doesn't like the Jedi, is very distrustful of their presence on Brendok, but then uses May to further her own agenda against the Jedi. The way she was making May angry, it seemed very similar to what we know of how Darksiders tap into their power. And it's not necessarily the reaction May would have had without Coral's interference. May basically goes way further than I think she would have, destroying the controls for the elevator, the turbo lift, so people can't get in and out, and then setting the fire. And it's only when the fire begins that May sort of snaps out of this angry trance that Coral has put her into and realizes the consequences of her actions. But yeah, if I was to blame anybody for what happened on Brendok, I think I would put a lot of the blame at Coral's feet.
Mother Coral's also, I think, responsible, along with the rest of the witches, for the possession of Kalnaka. So obviously Torben and Sol, you know, are there in trying to rescue the girls. And Indara and Kalnaka sort of fly in with the Jedi ship. They can't land, so Kalnaka sort of jumps off the access ramp and enters the frame. But the witches possess him, and we see a very angry dark side Wookiee here, going absolutely berserk. Chris, what was your thoughts on how Mother Coral and the witches possessed Kalnaka, and also just like Kalnaka's actions and how ferocious he was?
I mean, it was very spooky. It was, again, this sort of dark side magic element that they're tapping into here. They dissipate into the smoke. The next we see them, they're rhythmically swaying back and forth, and then suddenly there's a Wookiee in our midst, and they have taken possession of Kalnaka, and he is an absolute wrecking ball out there. He just comes in and is just throwing hands left, right, and center. You know, he's got the power of a Wookiee and the skill of a Jedi, which is a match made in heaven or maybe hell for Sol. And you know, you've got the Jedi who have to try and defend against him whilst the same time trying not to injure their best friend. So it's a very emotionally charged fight, and we finally learn where the Padawan's name's escaped me. Sorry. Torben, thank you. We learn, you know, how Torben got his scar, which we see in bloody detail at the end of the episode. I'm really glad we got to see Kalnaka fight because it's something that they sort of teased that we were going to see him. We'll get to see maybe in action, and then obviously when we actually catch up with him with the leads of the series, he's dead in his chair. But then we get this flashback. We get to see him at full strength, and we get to see him just wrecking shit left, right, and center. I thought it was a pretty good portrayal. I did titter a little bit at Torben being able to block the lightsaber held upside down while he was being pushed against a wall, but it did make for a very, very cool visual.
I think that adds to the traumatic experience. Like when he blocks that lightsaber, and you don't think he's going to till it happens. Like he's moments away from being killed there. Saul doesn't interfere, and then Indara doesn't interfere. Like he's going to die, and I think like the same thing that got on his head and maybe preyed on his fears, and he's maybe ashamed of that. Then also that he killed him, and I think he takes that with him for the rest of his life, sadly. Kat, what was your thoughts on Kelnakan, how he was possessed, and maybe your thoughts on how it took all of the Coven maybe to possess him?
Well, I think that helps to explain the differences maybe in skill. I wouldn't necessarily say force strength, but force skill. Kelnaka is a Jedi Knight at this stage, I think. I'm not sure if he's a master or if he's a knight, but he is far more experienced than Torben. He's also a lot older. I mean, he's a Wookiee. He must be at least 200 years old when we see him here in The Acolyte. And I think the fact that Mother Anastasia was able to get into Torben's head by herself shows that Torben has yet to protect his mind, have centered himself within the Force, whereas Kelnaka is clearly a Jedi who has centered himself in the Force. He is perhaps more guarded of his thoughts, wary of his feelings, and understands how those could be manipulated against him. And then it takes the entirety of the Coven working together to be able to get into his mind, to be able to possess him to such an extent that they can make Kelnaka fight. Because this isn't just like Torben being possessed basically to just immobilize him. This is Kelnaka being possessed to actually fight his best friends at this point and go against his own free will. There is no way Kelnaka would have willingly hurt Saul or Torben, and that resulting fight is insane to watch because you've got a Wookiee who has no idea that it's his friends he's fighting, and his friends are desperately trying not to hurt him, but Kelnaka has no control, and he can't stop himself from hurting his friends. So it is very emotionally charged. And I can kind of see now why he just became a hermit on Kofar, because to have his mind violated like that and for him to hurt Torben and Sol clearly left these emotional scars on Kelnaka.
I think again, Kelnaka probably realizes that he was moments away from like killing Torben, who's a Jedi Padawan, who, although he's not his master, like they've been on this mission for a while, and he will be a sort of teacher to him as being an older Jedi, and he's come very close to killing him, I suppose. Kat, what was your thoughts on obviously Indara arrives, tries to neutralize Kelnaka, and then obviously I don't really know how to describe what happens, but looks like maybe does she use the Force to kill all of the witches, or is it the severed connection which kills the witches? Like, what's your thoughts on sort of what goes down there?
Indara is the voice of reason throughout this entire episode. She is always trying to be patient, urging caution. And if everyone had listened to Indara, this entire disaster on Brendok, I don't think would have happened. So when Indara comes in to save the day, it's a moment I guess I was expecting, because she is, I think, the strongest out of all of them, because she is being cautious, she's being patient. and she uses the moment when Kelnaka is distracted to be able to disarm him, and then I think use the Force to probably get into his mind, similar to how we've seen Kylo Ren, Darth Maul, other Force users get into the heads of other people. But in this case, she's using it to force the witches out. I don't know what happens to the witches, but it does seem that they were using extreme amount of energy and strength to be able to control Kelnaka. And once Indara forces them out of the Wookiee's head, maybe the severance just leaves them so exhausted that they die, or being forcefully expelled from Kelnaka's mind causes them to die. But it's the Force. We're not supposed to be able to make sense of it. We're not supposed to understand how it works. It's the mysteries of the Force that is what makes these scenes so interesting, because there's no one answer.
Definitely. Chris, what's your thoughts on sort of the witch's possession of Kelnaka and sort of and how that ends with Indara seemingly saving the day?
Yeah, I like that idea that you had, that it took all of them and their combined power to kind of to possess him. Unlike Torben, who's a much less skilled Jedi at that point in time than Kalnaka is. I think it was a good job, really, that that she turned up at that point, because I think Sol was just about to wrestle with a very difficult decision about how he could possibly save Torben. And if she hadn't have turned up, I think we'd be looking at a much different story, and perhaps some of the parties in it would be a lot more guilty than they are now, if that can be believed.
No, definitely. I think you're spot on there. And then, do you believe that it was the witches sort of being pushed out of Kelnaka's mind that sort of leaves them, if not dead, at least incapacitated?
I mean, it's certainly presented that way. I mean, I wonder if maybe they are not used to, or either they've never have experienced it, or it's just a thing. If you interrupt this, this sort of ritual that they're doing, that they're giving a part of their life force to this dark magic, and maybe the reason why they fall is their sort of consciousness is lost in the force or something like that. I can't think of any particular reason why they'd all just fall over dead. I don't think that the consciousness leave, but there didn't seem to be any aggression to the Jedi pushing the consciousness out of his mind. It was just get out of there, not sort of like let's send a shockwave through everything. I think it was an unintended side effect. Certainly, everyone, when Saul comes across from later on, he didn't react in a way like, "Oh yeah, I assumed that's what happened." It was like, "Oh, all of these ladies are dead. Okay. Oh wait, no, I've got to go and try and save these girls and fail." But yeah, I think that's probably what happened. There must have been some kind of severance there, which ultimately ended up with them, losing their lives.
I wouldn't have obviously so they've all connected to Kelnaka, right? And then they've been pushed out of Kelnaka. But I wouldn't have, when they've been pushed out, they haven't had a chance to get back to their own bodies, if that makes sense. And that's their own fault.
Yeah, it
They
could
shouldn't
be.
be doing naughty things. You know what I mean? It wouldn't happen. But
Yeah, yeah. I mean, if you're going to play with fire, if you're going to play with Wookiees, you deserve what you get.
indeed. And we're warned at the beginning of the episode, don't call a Wookiees cooking because he'll kick off. Forgot about that. Moving on from there, I think perfect segue into the girls themselves. We come across both Osha and May on different sides of sort of a destroyed bridge, and obviously Sol gets there and has a decision to make. Kat, what's your thoughts on sort of where Osha and May end up and sort of the situation Sol's put in?
It's a terrible situation because throughout this entire episode, I felt that Sol was misguided, but he was trying to do the best with the information he was provided. It's very clever cinematography and very clever filming in the way that the scenes Sol observes are where it appears that the Coven are being quite harsh to the girls when Mother Coral is scolding them for being outside of the city, the Citadel, and that they shouldn't be wandering around Brendok freely. And the next time he observes them, it appears that Mother Anastasia is being aggressive in her teachings towards them. So Sol possibly thinks that the Coven isn't a safe place for these girls. He thinks that taking them to be Jedi is the best option because it will offer them a better life. We know, as the viewers, that what Sol was seeing was just very rare moments and that the Coven loved these girls. Morales was just being harsh in that moment because she wanted the girls to be able to defend themselves. Mother Coral is just Mother Coral. She seems to just run on anger 24/7. And it's that Rashomon effect that has been just the driving force behind the writing of this series. And Sol's actions were just what he thought was best with what he had seen. So the decision he ultimately makes is tragic and it leaves him so guilty because he is trying to save both Osha and May, and yet he doesn't have the strength to be able to save both girls. So he has to make this decision of who is he going to save. Ultimately, he decides to save Osha. Is that because the Force was telling him? Is that because he's formed some kind of attachment, which Indara was warning him against? The choices Sol made, only he knows. But it was so well written. And I can see where Sol was coming from. Yes, his actions were misguided and wrong to an extent because he is definitely observing a culture that he knows nothing about and jumping to conclusions. But at the same time, he was just trying to protect those girls. So it's just beautiful, beautiful Star Wars strategy.
Well, it certainly is. Chris, over to you. Sort of, what's your thoughts on Sol's sort of journey through the episode, as Kat said, and then obviously with the dilemma he has at the end there?
I mean, he's also seems a lot more impulsive in this episode than in the present, if you will, that the series takes place in. He is definitely projecting, and he's called out on it a couple of times in the episode, not to confuse what he wants with what Osha wants. He seems very much like he's searching for the virgins. He sees the girls, and as Kat rightly pointed out, he only sees a certain point of view. He sees the girls, potentially, being abused, being pushed over. He sees, one side of a conversation. We also finally get an explanation as well, just to mention as to what that noise was in episode 3. So it wasn't. It was the Jedi sneaking around in the back, and then we see Sol kind of becomes hell bent on this journey that he needs to save these girls, and primarily Osha. Of the two of them, he seems like he is. I thought he was rather rash in this episode, and I think he, in the present day, has reflected on how rash he was and the mistakes he made, and how obviously he's forced into these actions. As in to go to the mine by Torben, who's being even more rash. So he seems quite sensible in comparison, but he is kind of pushing this along, and he's even saying, no, come on, let's not go to the Jedi Council. No, we don't need to do that. Just come with me. Let's have a look. You'll see what I mean with your own eyes. And he's kind of pushing all of this along because he's desperate to to take Osha as a Padawan. And an interesting little detail that I noticed at the beginning was that he's called out on the fact that he doesn't have a Padawan, and the reason is maybe because he's a bit rash. And then I'm not saying this is why he acts that way, but it very much kind of, underpins his motivations in this episode. He doesn't yet have a Padawan. He feels like he needs to, take someone under his wing. And it is the next person that he sees. It is either May or Osha, potentially both of them, and ultimately ends up being Osha. So I think he's been racked by guilt with this for years. I don't necessarily think that he, did anything awful. I don't think, but I think he is racked by the feeling that he did something worse than he did because of how rash he went into this. I think the worst thing that Sol, did, he killed somebody in this, and that's going to weigh heavily on his mind, especially when it turned, her parting words to him were that, actually, I was going to let it go, and then you went and killed me, mate. The choice that he makes at the end, he can't hold up both of those platforms, and he has to make a choice, and he chooses Osha. And, ultimately, he does manage to save one of the girls. I think if I was in that position, I think the guilt would probably rack, me as well. But he still was doing the right thing in that situation. And, I think if we ask ourselves from what Sol was presented with, and which girl would you save? Would it be the girl who seems to be gravitating towards the light, or the girl who seems to be gravitating towards the dark side of the Force?
Definitely. And I think also it's definitely a side effect of like what he's gone through, that battle with Kelnaka, probably took a lot of energy, both force energy and, bodily energy, like, physically and mentally and force wise, out of him, where once he gets to here, he can't hold them both up because he's exhausted. Where maybe if he hadn't gone through all that, he might have been able to at least last a bit longer holding them both up. I also think that by holding them both up for a short amount of time, when he does release May, I feel it gives May a chance to like maybe use the Force herself, and maybe that's why she doesn't die. She obviously falls, but she obviously, is able to deal with that. If that makes sense. Let's go to you, Kat. Just what's your thoughts on May falling, and sort of in what could be the next moments for May?
Well, May has to ultimately feel quite betrayed, I suppose. The Jedi not only took Osha, but they chose Osha over her, which is quite a difference to May's position within the Coven. The Coven seem to really prefer May to Osha in a way, possibly because May is far more into their dark side magic, their way of living, and perhaps is less rebellious than Osha. So May seems to be the favored one in the Coven, yet she's not favored by the Jedi. So that feeling of betrayal possibly sets up how she is so easily lured to the dark side. But I think you're right. The way that Sol holds up the bridge for a period of time does possibly allow May to think. I think a lot of her actions up until that point are her not thinking, they're just her reacting. So if she can think for a moment, then yes, she could absolutely use the Force to not stop her fall, but stop her from hitting the ground. We have seen Force users do this. One of the most prominent ways I can think of it is Kylo Ren, number one in the Age of the Resistance comics, where Snoke throws him off a cliff, and Kylo is able to channel the Force to not hit the ground but hover for a moment and then land. So that could be exactly what May does. How she then gets off Brendok is another question.
I'm assuming maybe she gets picked up. I imagine. Mother Anastasia says something quite. She could be clutching at straws here just to sort of to get at the Jedi, but does turn out to be true. She says someday those noble intentions you all have will destroy every Jedi in the galaxy. I don't know what your thoughts were, Chris, when you heard her say that.
Well, I mean, I thought that was a nice little a callback, but really call forward. But to us, a callback to where we ultimately know all of this is heading. We can't forget, although this is set earlier than we've ever seen anything before in live action, it is all still heading towards the same point. And I think that line might have been put in there deliberately. There may be some things that come up next episode that guide us towards Star Wars Episode 1 in a lot more of maybe a clear direction. We've already had a few characters pop up from it. We've had the mention of the Virgins as well, which, as you mentioned, was first introduced or mentioned by Qui-Gon in Episode 1. So I feel like they're doing something very deliberate there. They're obviously doing the old, giving us a prophecy type of thing, a Maggie the Frog type of thing, if you like Game of Thrones, but they're also trying to connect it to us as viewers to the Skywalker saga as we know it.
Definitely. Kat, what sort of your thoughts on sort of what Chris is saying there?
Absolutely agree. These noble intentions is what drives the Jedi, and yet noble intentions can sometimes be wrong. The noble intentions of the Jedi had them taking children to train as Padawans, and yet those same noble intentions had Qui-Gon take a Padawan, a child from Tatooine, who would end up helping to destroy the Jedi Order. The noble intentions of the Jedi made them too close to the Galactic Senate and the Republic, leading them to becoming generals and fighting in a war, which was never something that the Jedi was meant to do. The noble intentions led to the Jedi becoming soldiers. They were peacekeepers. So Mother Anastasia's line has all these different facets of the noble intentions of the Jedi, trying to do good, trying to be a source of light within the galaxy, and yet those same intentions, they backfired. They would eventually lead to Palpatine being able to destroy the Jedi Order because of I suppose it's almost like not necessarily a rot, but there's these cracks already forming in the Jedi Order. Jedi going rogue, Jedi not reporting to the Council, things being covered up, an independent review into the workings of the Jedi that Vernestra clearly does not want happening. And these cracks and these noble intentions are the paveway to Order 66.
Speaking of cover-ups, I think at the end of this episode, these four Jedi agree to sort of never tell the Council what really happened and let Saul take Osha as his Padawan. So what's your thoughts there, Chris, on sort of the things these Jedi have been through for them then to sort of not share them with the Council?
I mean, it's interesting that they're all on the same page about this, at the end. Let's not tell the Council about this when previously they really hadn't been in regards to involving the Council. I think that the trauma that they've gone through is kind of sort of trauma bonded them through this, and they're all guilty to sort of different levels of taking part in it. I think they're going to sort of almost take this. The idea is that we're going to do this. We're going to take it to our graves, and it all impacts them in different ways and to different levels. But I think it's an interesting idea. But the thing with secrets is that they always come out one way or another, and that's what we're seeing right here. All of this great big secret, it's unraveling in front of their minds, and ultimately, will we start the next episode with Sol, finishing the story, and what will May's reaction be to him telling her the truth from his perspective?
Definitely. I go over to you, Kat. What's your thoughts on what will happen in the episode 8, the final episode of this season of The Acolyte?
Oh my gosh, I'm not even convinced I could predict anything right, because this series has just been written in such a way that it's hard to predict where it's going to be going, which is the definition of any good mystery series. You don't want to be able to figure out where it's going. It's not the point of a mystery. But I do believe that it could open with Saul finishing the story, revealing the truth to May, and May could break those bonds if she is angry enough, betrayed enough, uses the dark side of the Force to then possibly kill Saul. However, there is another thing, and that is Saul's actions look mightily suspicious to the Jedi. He just gave out a distress signal saying that his entire team has been killed. He is the lone survivor, and then dashes off into hyperspace as the Jedi arrive to Kofar. That looks very bad for Saul. And from what Vernestra could see on Kofar at the bodies, someone with a lightsaber killed all those people, all those Jedi. Could they put the dots together that Saul has gone rogue and killed his team, then run off with a criminal into hyperspace? Is he going to become the scapegoat that allows Khmer, the stranger, to be able to stay hidden as a dark side user? I don't know, but it's going to be very exciting.
It certainly is. And then one last thing, obviously, we begun by talking about virgins and a virgins in the Force and how important that is. I believe it's in the journals that Luke Skywalker has that we see Rey looking through in The Rise of Skywalker, maybe. But it sort of mentions the fact that the world between worlds is also sort of a conduit and a channel and a vergence of the Force. Can you see maybe this tying into that, if not in the next episode, but maybe in future seasons of The Acolyte, Cat?
Vergence is such a fantastic word, and the way it ties into some of these major elements of Force lore within Star Wars is fascinating. Mortis, Planet X, you just mentioned now the world between worlds. It all connects. That's Star Wars. Star Wars is all these connections. And the amount of Force mystique, Force mystery that the Acolyte has presented and used would definitely make me think that the world between worlds could then become a part of it, because it's just more weird Force stuff, which the Acolyte has completely been about.
No, definitely. Chris, any thoughts on, obviously I know you've watched Star Wars Rebels, so like the world between worlds and how that can be a vergence, and then is there anything in the episode that we haven't discussed that you want to highlight?
Yeah, I love Star Wars Rebels. It's well overdue a rewatch for me, actually. I loved it to pieces. It's where obviously that world between worlds was first introduced. I wasn't the most hot on that concept when it was introduced, because I didn't quite like the idea of time travel in Star Wars, but it has grown on me quite a lot, and obviously that's not what it ultimately ended up being anyway. But I did the World Between Worlds. It's interesting if that could be a Virgins. It's interesting if maybe that's where some of these, one thing that we've seen quite a lot in the Disney era of Star Wars are sacred sites. We've seen, we saw them in the Mandalorian. We saw that old Jedi site where Grogu sits and meditates for a while. We then saw it appear in Ahsoka as well, where there was a lot of scenes taking place around there. And indeed, when Ahsoka kind of gets pushed off the cliff there, that's when she ends up in the World Between Worlds. And then we've also seen them on Brendok as well, although just fleetingly in sort of panning wide angle shots that seems to be somewhat Stonehenge-esque constructions, excuse me, that's a word I'm looking for, which are dotted around the place. So it's interesting if these would be connected as maybe Virgences, or if they are entryways into the World Between Worlds for those who are powerful enough in the Force. In terms of anything that I might want to talk about from this episode, not so much about this episode, but more looking forward. I mean, I almost feel like we've got a lot of story to wrap up in episode 8. I feel like there has to be, a season 2, or at least that's what the creators have in mind, because there's a lot of story threads. We've got, Sol and the Council. We've got, May and Osha need to, reunite as well and have a, conflict there. We've got what's going on with the Jedi, searching for Sol. We've got this investigation that's going on. That there is a lot of threads which are going to be interesting to see which ones are still dangling, and the biggest one of all being Khmer, the stranger, and what ultimately happens with him. Does he have a master? What's going on there? We're still, we've been speculating on that for weeks, and there's a lot of things that, we're on a little wish list that we have to tick off next week. I'm not expecting all of them, but it's going to be interesting to see what ties together and what situation we end in come the end of the Acolyte season 1.
Kat, anything from this episode that we've not discussed yet that you want to highlight?
Well, I think the only thing I would really like to mention, talking about Khmer and who is he? Is he the master? Is he the apprentice? Is that we do hear the theme again that belongs to Knights of Ren. We hear Kylo Ren's theme playing during the battle of Sol, Torben, and Kalnaka. It seems to be this reappearing motif. I don't know if it's just in there because it is a really cool theme, and perhaps they're alluding to the dark side having a presence in that moment, or if it's suggesting something more.
And only time will tell, I suppose. I feel like there's a lot left unanswered for only like one episode left. Like, what's going to happen with Osha and the stranger, Khmer? What's going to happen with May and Sol? Is Sol going to confront the stranger again? What is going on with Mog and Master Minestra? And are they going to catch up with Sol or catch up with Osha, or both at the same time? What's happening on Coruscant with sort of this rogue senator who, maybe he's friends with the Sith and that's why he's trying to cause problems for the Jedi in the Senate? Is that going to be fully addressed? Yeah, like there's a lot there. And, the episode's probably going to be 45 minutes again, I imagine, around that mark. So, I think we're definitely going to end with, some of those things will be answered, but I think some of those things won't be, which is great. And I just hope that they do greenlight the season 2, because I think this show definitely needs it. This time period definitely needs it. And as Chris said, I think we will steadily go towards the Phantom Menace, because the things we've introduced in this episode, we've introduced sort of a Sith apprentice, even if he might not be Sith, but he wields that red lightsaber and he's killed a lot of Jedi, right? The fact that the Jedi don't find out about that, it seems like, to where they're surprised about Maul. So something's going to happen in either the next episode or the next season where that's either covered up or the Jedi who know about it don't get a chance to talk about it. We've been introduced to the cortosis, the lightsaber resistant material, which ties into sort of Sith of the past in Legends who could become canon, and tie them into sort of the Phantom Menace and sort of where Palpatine comes from, I suppose. I suppose we've hinted at problems at the Senate. Is this sort of the beginning of maybe not Palpatine, but maybe a previous Sith planet, sort of to put the Senate and the Jedi on edge is what leads to the Clone Wars, if that makes sense. So yeah, I just think there's just so much that we don't know, so much that can happen that I think we're definitely going to go into a season 2. Has season 2 been announced, Kat? Do you know?
It has not. There has been no confirmation or announcement of season 2. Season 1 is meant to be a standalone story, so definitely some of the threads that we've spoken about will be answered, but you are completely right. There are too many to tie up neatly in one episode. And I really hope there's going to be another season, because I have not been this excited about an era of Star Wars in quite a while.
My only worry would be the budget. Obviously, we know that the Acolyte's budget's quite a lot for each episode, partly because it's being done sort of on location without use of stagecraft or the I forget the other name of it, the volume, yeah. But I mean, that doesn't mean they couldn't start using it in season 2 to bring the budget down, I suppose. And it was quite well watched. So maybe Disney will go ahead with the budget for season 2. But that would be my only worry, I think, with whether it got a season 2 or not, I suppose. But no, I think that brings an end to us discussing episode 7, Choice. Throw back with you, Chris. Just any last thoughts about the episode, the series in general, and then we'll move on.
I think, for all the things you can say about the series, one thing that's absolutely outstanding is that we've got no idea where some of these threads are going come next week. And that's something that we don't often get in Star Wars, because this is a new era to live action anyway. We don't know exactly what's coming, and it's a little bit too far in the past for us to be able to accurately say, oh, it's leading directly into X. So, it gives us that sort of water cooler moment of what do you think will happen. Often with a lot of series, we kind of know. We kind of know where it's going to end up, and there might be a little bit of a cliffhanger of a character disappearing or being, blasted off to another galaxy by space whales. But ultimately, we still know that the original trilogy is going to happen, and then the prequel trilogy, and so on. So I'm excited just because I've got no idea what's going to happen, and I like it. I wanted to ask you guys though. I heard something which was attributed to Leslie Leslie Hayland, but I don't know if you guys have heard it and if it's true or not. They said that there would be 2 Sith appearing in this series. If that's true, how do you read into that? Do you read into that have we already seen 2? Does that mean that we are going to get, a Darth Plagueis appearance next week? Any ideas?
Kat, you're the expert on Leslie Headland interviews, I think, out of me and you. So has that been said?
She has indeed confirmed that there would be 2 Darksiders in this series, and Camilla is clearly one of them. What that could reference, though, for the second one, I'm not sure. Does it mean that Osha is going to turn and become his dark side acolyte, in which case she would be the second? Or is there going to be, right at the end, some kind of reveal that Camilla does have a master?
Could it also be a bluff and is May not the other one?
It could be. I mean, there is one shot from the trailer that we haven't seen, which is the stranger silhouetted holding the lightsaber, wearing the mask, which we've assumed has been Kamiya, but the fact now that we haven't seen that particular moment so far, that leaves it open to being Osha standing there wearing the mask. And maybe May is watching her. There is no guarantee that Kamiya is going to come out of this season alive, which has possibly been my favourite aspect of The Acolyte, is that because we are dealing with a completely new era, a completely new cast of characters, the stakes have been so high. None of these characters have been safe. You know, Jackie and Yord weren't safe. And that's something that other live action series haven't had, is that real stakes.
No, I think you're bang on there. You certainly are. I think that brings an end to sort of my thoughts on the episode, and I'm definitely excited for episode 8. One thing that's been really good, I suppose, before we wrap things up on the episode, you know, Hasbro did get like pre-orders out for like all of the main characters straight away, including Osha. You know, obviously Osha wasn't revealed to pre-order until after the first episode, because obviously we'd only seen May in the trailers. But what seems to happen is that now we're further along. Obviously, Kamiya has been revealed, you know, the stranger, but like not available, even though he would probably be the coolest figure to have. Obviously, they had his helmet good to go as soon as the episode happened. You know, he could pre-order the helmet, the Hasbro Black Series helmet, but no Kamiya figure from what I've seen, Kat, and I would certainly buy one. They could definitely take my money. They could take double my money, because I'd buy one Black Series 6-inch and I would buy one Vintage Collection 3/4 inch.
Absolutely. I want my Black Series Kamiya. He will be going on the shelf. In fact, I want all the figures from this series. I haven't felt like collecting a whole wave of Black Series or Funko since The Last Jedi, but yeah, I want all of these characters on my shelf.
Chris, I know you probably don't collect as much as we do, but you know, we'll all agree that Kamiya's looking pretty awesome, jacked, but even with a mask on and his cloak, he's still viciously evil and good looking. Would you take a Black Series Kamiya to sit on your desk, so when you're on Teams you can just look at him and go, "Yep, I'm cool"?
I mean, you know, if you're offering me one, Peter, I'm not going to say no.
I'll buy you one.
But yeah, but yeah, no, I mean, definitely. I mean, he's a very cool looking character. He's and you know, the actor's endeared himself in his performance. I think, and you know, initially I'd been a little bit skeptical of him being the dark side, but last week I absolutely was encapsulated by his performance, and it was a very good contrast, showing, you know, just how, you know, it was a performance that he was putting on. He was playing a role, which, you know, we all assumed anyway, but it was just great seeing that play out on screen. I think he's a very cool dark side user, and he'd look great on a shelf alongside, you know, Vader, Maul, Kylo Ren. Why not the stranger?
Indeed. And Kat, last one, I suppose you'll have the answer to this, is there been any reveals of any Acolyte Lego sets yet?
There has not been, which I am actually not surprised about, because the Lego designers do not do much for the live action Disney series. I don't know why, but we still don't have any Lego sets from Andor.
But we
saying.
have had a Lego set revealed for Skeleton Crew.
We have. So it's just this weird... they just pick things sometimes that don't necessarily make sense. They give us grey chunks of rock from Kenobi, nothing from Andor, a leaked ship now from Skeleton Crew. But I would certainly love to have some Jackie and Yord minifigures.
I mean, just like Kamiya the Stranger himself, you know, just being able to have sort of that mask would be pretty awesome. You know, character with that helmet to clip on would be a unique selling point. I think whatever set that minifigures in is going to sell. Do you know what I mean? But maybe Skeleton Crew has a Lego set first, because it is the Jude Law effect, and everybody fancies Jude Law, including Lego. Would you agree, Kat?
If you say so.
Maybe it's an older generation thing, but me as like a 35-year-old, Jude Law is still very handsome and has always been handsome throughout my life, I would say. Chris, what's your thoughts on Jude Law?
He's very handsome, and he always has been throughout my life.
Kat, have you seen The Holiday? Oh
No.
my god!
In fact, I'm trying to think of a film that I've seen with Jude Law in. I can only think of one in which he was a voiceover. He has a very good
Is that
voiceover.
the Owl movie? The Owls.
No, it's Rise of the Guardians by DreamWorks.
Has that not got owls in it?
No, that's not got owls. It's got Jack Frost and Jude Law voices
What
the
am I
villain.
thinking? I'm sure there's a film. It's got Guardians in the title, and it's about flying owls. Chris, am I right?
Oh, I'm not going to disagree with you, but
Yes, I know the one you're talking about. And it is also Guardians. Is it Guardians, the Owls of Ga'Hoole?
That's the one. Yeah. See.
yes, Legend of the Guardians, the Owls of Ga'Hoole.
Is Jude Law one of them? See an owl?
I
bet he's the most handsome one in the film. The best owl there is.
Oh, it doesn't look like it.
Let's just pretend for the listeners that Jude Law is a very, very good owl.
I'm sure he's a great owl.
But Kat, you need to watch The Holiday. Jude Law is fantastic in The Holiday, but also just obviously he's not playing himself, but I think he would be like that in real life, which is like a wonderful person who's flawed a bit but wonderful. So Christmas is coming in like 6 months' time, right? Well, not 6 months anymore. What? 5 months. So I think you should watch The Holiday soon.
Okay, I'll add it to the watch list to figure out the Jude Law effect.
The Jude Law effect. I mean, I can't wait for Skeleton Crew just for the Jude Law effect. It's going to be wild. It's going to be wild. Chris, any closing thoughts on anything, including Jude Law?
I am desperate to find out a little bit more about Khmer, who he is, who he was, what he wants, maybe who he's mentored by or has been mentored by in the past. So I'm hoping that next week is a very Stranger heavy episode. I would love it if it had a bit of a longer runtime. I'll have the first episode of this series, and we got to give justice to both Sol and Khmer's stories, which are obviously running parallel with May and Osha's. So I'm hoping for a lot of dark side next week.
Kat, what's the last thing you want to talk about? And is it what Jude Law is going to be called in Skeleton Crew?
I mean, to be fair, he could just be called Jude Law because I feel that is actually quite a Star Wars name. I agree with Chris that I'm hoping this last episode of The Acolyte is going to just be fully dark side and give us all the Khmer content. All of the Khmer content, because he is, I think, the standout character from this series.
Chris, if me and you were going to record a podcast, right, about Jude Law and a conspiracy theory, what would that podcast be called and where could people find it? That's just for you to plug your podcast, by the way.
Right, and I was trying to think of a witty sort of like Jude Law and Order or something.
That's a good one. I like that one.
Yeah, we'll go with that one. But you can find my podcast on all good podcast platforms. Dystopian Simulation Radio. We've had a big old session recording everything over the summer while we're both of us have various other projects going on that's going to take up our time. So we've got a lot of things in the bank that are coming out over the summer. You can find us also on Instagram at d.s.radio, and we'd love to have you come and join us.
Kat, where can the people find you on your social medias?
You can find me at Kat Kylo on Twitter, where I'm always happy to talk about anything Star Wars, Lego, or Kylo Ren. I'm always there for a positive conversation.
And anything new from you on blocksmagazine.com or whatever the website is?
Well, in the latest issue of Blocks Magazine, I'm taking a look at the Animal Crossing Lego sets. And we've got an upcoming interview for the Icons Retro Radio. But on the website, I have been doing a lot on Lego Fortnite. So if you're interested in jumping into this new version of the Fortnite, which is similar to Minecraft, but you're running around as a minifigure and trying not to get eaten by wolves, then I have plenty of tips and tricks for you at blocksmag.com.
And speaking of Blocks Magazine, this episode you're listening to will be 163 of Star Wars, but our previous episode, 162, was a fantastic interview with author Graham E. Hancock, who is the editor over at Blocks Magazine with Kat, but he's also the author of the brand new Lego Star Wars coffee table book. It is Lego Star Wars, The Force of Creativity. It's a deluxe coffee table book, probably the greatest Lego Star Wars coffee table book you can find. But definitely go listen to that episode. Wonderful conversation with Graham about how he's a Lego geek, how he's a Star Wars fan, and how those things came together to create the greatest Lego Star Wars book of all time. And as this episode goes out, it'll be the 11th, 12th of July. You can pre-order the book at lego.com before it's released on July the 20th. You can find me, the Geordie Jedi Pete, at that handle on X and on Instagram. You can find the podcast on Twitter at BorsStar. You can also find the podcast on Facebook, TikTok, YouTube, LinkedIn, everywhere else at Star Wars Podcast. Please check those out. If you're listening on Apple Podcasts or on Spotify, please leave us a top review. Lovely 5-star review, all of the stars, lovely little sentence, keeps us smiling all day, only takes you a moment, and it helps people find the show. And again, if you're listening on any of the other wonderful podcast applications, if it has the option to leave a review, just leave us a top one. Again, keeps us smiling all day, only takes you a few moments, and it helps people find the show. But guys, thank you very much for joining me. Next week, we come to the end of The Acolyte Season 1. May the Force be with you all. And remember, always tell that to Kanja Club.
The Dorky Diva Show presents
Why is this seat so much more comfortable?
the long-awaited sequel to the adventures of the Zolan Dart audio drama.
Have you seen the captain's datapad?
Trying to work, Murph.
Piloting the Zolan Dart by himself,
You do understand the details of this particular job, correct?
I've been on plenty of jobs like this. With you!
Reldar Sias returns to a planet he thought he'd left behind for good.
Is there a reason you didn't mention I was tagging along?
Hopefully having you there will make others think twice about messing with me.
Making new friends
Oh, you must be the pilot of the Zolan Dart, yes?
I guess I am.
and reconnecting with old ones,
Reldar?
Vera?
What are you doing here?
until past grudges resurface.
I'd be minding my own business if I were you.
Well, if your business wasn't being handled right in front of my face, maybe I could mind my own business. We have to leave. Now.
Why the rush all of a sudden?
We're in trouble.
If it isn't little Reldar Sias.
Hey, Yorick. Long time no see.
Roz already knows you're here.
Oh,
Look who decided to come home.
Reldar must confront his origin,
I must admit, I never saw this as being a part of your past, Softshell.
or let it define his future.
I will get what is owed to me, no matter the cost.
because what Roz is trying to do is wrong.
Says you.
My blasters, we're going to need these. Take that, Slimo.
Who do you think you are?
The Adventures of the Zolan Dart, Episode 2, coming soon.